Welcome to Malifaux University. 410. Terrain, height, blocking, and the shadow of terrain. Malifaux is a rich, immersive experience with intricate models. When well-painted models are put on a well-decorated table, the game is even better. Terrain can be tricky, and it comes with many layers of rules that affect gameplay. This video will explain what it means for terrain to have height and the blocking characteristic, and how those qualities combine to form the shadow of terrain. Video 407 covers dense and concealing terrain. Video 408 addresses terrain with the destructible, severe, and hazardous characteristics, and Video 409 covers impassable and climbable terrain. This applies to terrain that is placed on the table during setup, or markers that are created or dropped during gameplay that have these characteristics, and therefore are considered terrain. Height is the way of measuring how tall terrain is, much like a model's size. If a marker does not have a height trait, it has no height, and is considered height 0 if a game effect needs a number. This is all scrap, corpse, and scheme markers. Before the game, when you and your opponent are discussing the terrain features, you should measure the buildings and determine which are climbable, which are impassable, and what the height of everything is. Some buildings have sloped roofs and might be imprecise in their heights. Round the height of terrain to the nearest whole number. A wall that is 2 1/4 inches tall should be considered height 2. A building that is 3 3/4 inch tall should be considered height 4. When measuring range between models or objects, you normally just measure the horizontal distance between the two objects' bases as seen from above. Height can add a vertical element to measuring range if one or both of the objects is on terrain with height. A good formula for calculating this range is the horizontal distance between the two objects plus the height of the higher of the two objects minus the height of the lower of the two objects. The key is to remember that the difference in heights can be positive or 0, but never less than 0, so you have to do the parentheses first, just like in math class. Let's look at a few examples. Von Schill is on the table measuring range to Summerteeth Jones on this height 3 crate. The horizontal distance between them is 7 inches. Summer is 3 inches up, but Von Schill is size 2, for a difference of +1. The effective distance between the two models is then 8 inches. Later, Von Schill is on this height 2 crate, while Summer is still on the height 3 crate. The horizontal distance between them is still 7 inches, but now Von Schill's effective height is 4 inches, his size 2 plus the height 2 terrain he's on. Summer is still higher on the height 3 terrain, so our formula is 7 plus 3 minus 4. The number in parentheses cannot be less than 0, so the height differential is just set at 0, making the distance between the models 7 inches. Later still, Von Schill is on the height 3 crate, while Summer is on the ground. The horizontal distance is still 7 inches. We take the height of Von Schill's terrain, 3 inches, and subtract Summer's size 2. That gives us a +1 to add to our horizontal distance of 7 inches, making the effective distance between them 8 inches again. You might be asking why we don't add the size of the more elevated model when we're doing these calculations, and the answer is quite simple. When Von Schill is shooting at Summerteeth Jones, who is up high, Summer's size doesn't matter because Von Schill doesn't have to hit him in the head. Summer's feet are just fine. When Von Schill is up high and shooting at Summer below, why do we not add Von Schill's size? Because he's not shooting lasers out of his eyes. We assume he's crouching to shoot at the lower target, so his size doesn't matter. The size of his target below matters because Summer's size effectively brings his head closer to Von Schill's rifle. When terrain has the blocking trait, it cannot be seen through by models. When a model tries to draw a line of sight, no sight line that passes through blocking terrain will work if the height of that blocking terrain is equal to or greater than both models or objects involved. Remember that line of sight in Malifaux is drawn top-down, and just like models, the important factor is the terrain's base, not its sculpt. You could have a height 5 blocking tree with all its branches on a 50 mm base. The branches and curve of the trunk don't matter. If the sight line passes over the base, that's when it could be blocked. If you're looking around a model or terrain when drawing line of sight, a single clear sight line means an unobstructed shot, and terrain that is shorter than either model is ignored altogether. Here we see a size 2 Freikorpsmann behind this height 1 blocking crate. The Freikorpsmann is 2 inches away from it, and size 2 Summerteeth Jones, who is 6 inches away from the Freikorpsmann on the other side of the crate, fires his boomer projectile attack. He ignores the crate, which is shorter than him, and makes an unobstructed shot, even though 2 of his sight lines cross over the crate. If the terrain's height is equal to or greater than the size of both the models or objects involved, sight lines that pass through blocking terrain are blocked. So if you have a height 2 blocking wall with size 2 Summerteeth Jones on one side and a size 2 Freikorpsmann on the other, those 2 models cannot see each other because the wall is as tall as both of them. If size 3 Lenny Jones were on one side, then both he and the Freikorpsmann could see each other because Lenny is taller than the wall. If blocking terrain is ever on top of other blocking terrain, then you add their heights together. If Rasputina creates a height 4 blocking ice pillar marker on top of this height 2 blocking crate, then it is effectively height 6 blocking terrain. The same rule applies to models on top of blocking terrain. Add the model size to the height of the terrain to determine whether line of sight can be drawn between them. Rules for drawing line of sight with models is explained further in video 411 about line of sight. If terrain has both blocking and height, it casts a shadow equal to the terrain's height, but no more than 3 inches. Models in shadow have additional protections against ranged attacks when the attacker's sight lines cross that terrain. We'll look at examples and explain these rules as we go. Summerteeth Jones is still trying to shoot the Freikorpsmann, who has moved next to the crate, placing himself within the 1-inch shadow of the crate. When a model is in the shadow of terrain, any sight lines to that model passing through the terrain give the target cover, even if the other sight lines are clear, and even if the terrain is ignored due to its height, such as this example with the height 1 crate. When a model with cover is the target of a projectile attack, it gains +1 to its defense stat against that projectile attack. If the attack succeeds, it then suffers a negative modifier to the damage flip. This applies only to projectile attacks. Other ranged attacks are unaffected. When Summer fires his boomer against the Freikorpsmann, who is in the shadow of the crate, the Freikorpsmann has cover, because at least one of Summer's sight lines cross over the terrain that is creating the shadow the Freikorpsmann is in, and Summer is using a projectile attack. If Lenny Jones were on this side of the Freikorpsmann and drew line of sight to him with his whacked piglet projectile attack, the Freikorpsmann would not gain cover because none of Lenny's sight lines cross over the terrain creating the shadow. Naturally, blocking terrain that is taller than all the models involved still blocks sight lines that pass through it like it normally would. The previous rule still applies though, so if there's a clear sight line to a target in the shadow of terrain, but other sight lines pass over that terrain, models in that terrain's shadow gain cover against projectile attacks. Here we see a Freikorpsmann drawing line of sight to 2 potential targets with his clockwork revolver projectile attack. The height 5 blocking tree casts a shadow 3 inches around itself, which covers Lenny Jones, but not Summerteeth Jones. One sight line between the Freikorpsmann and Summer is clear of the tree's base, so he may fire normally. Summer is outside of the tree's shadow, so gains no cover. One sight line between the Freikorpsmann and Lenny is blocked by the tree's base, and since the big henchman is within the tree's shadow, he gains cover against the Freikorpsmann's projectile attack. When the gremlins return fire, the sight lines between them and the Freikorpsmann that pass through the tree are blocked due to its height, but the Freikorpsmann is not in the shadow of the tree and does not gain cover. When a model is in the shadow of terrain that is the same height as or taller than the model, then all sight lines to and from that model that pass through that terrain are completely blocked by the terrain. This makes perfect sense when you have a height 5 tree between two models, but it feels tricky when the terrain is taller than only one of the models and you would normally ignore it. Check this out. Here we have the size 2 Frycorman on one side of a height 2 blocking wall and size 3 Lenny Jones on the other side. Each model is 3 inches away from the wall, which casts a 2-inch shadow. Both models can see one another since Lenny is taller than the wall. Since neither model is in the shadow of the wall, both may ignore the wall when drawing line of sight for ranged attacks because Lenny is taller than the wall. Let's say Lenny walks up to the wall, placing himself in the shadow. The Frycorman is not in the shadow, so when he uses his Clockwork Revolver projectile attack on Lenny, Lenny gains cover since the Frycorman's sight lines cross over the terrain casting the shadow that Lenny is in. When Lenny uses his Whacked Piglet projectile attack on the Frycorman gains no cover because he is outside the shadow of the wall and gains no benefit from it. Let's reverse the situation and place the Frycorman next to the wall and Lenny farther away outside the shadow. The Frycorman is in the shadow of terrain the same height as his size, so all sight lines crossing that terrain are now completely blocked. The Frycorman cannot draw line of sight to Lenny, and Lenny cannot draw line of sight to the Frycorman, despite Lenny's size 3. If Lenny were to move within the shadow while the Frycorman were also in the shadow, the situation would not change, and neither model would be able to draw line of sight to the other since all the sight lines cross over the terrain. Now let's say Lenny moves to the corner and they are both still in the shadow of the wall just within 1 inch of one another. The Frycorman has a 0-inch engagement range compared to Lenny's 2-inch engagement range, so the outcast is engaged by Lenny, but Lenny is not engaged by the outcast. Cover does not affect melee attacks, so Lenny could use his Whack-and Stick without concern for the shadow. If he were to target the Frycorman with his Whacked Piglet projectile attack, the Frycorman would gain cover since one of Lenny's sight lines crosses and is blocked by the wall casting the shadow. If he opted to use his Toss ranged attack, the Frycorman would not gain cover because cover applies only to projectile attacks. If the Frycorman were farther back and could use his Clockwork Revolver against Lenny, Lenny would gain cover as previously explained because at least one of the Frycorman's sight lines crosses over the terrain and Lenny is in the shadow of it. The situation changes only a little when the attacking model is on top of the terrain casting the shadow and the target is within that shadow. Again, sight lines crossing terrain that is taller than either model are completely blocked when the target is in that terrain's shadow. Unless the attacking model is at or hanging over the edge of that terrain, its sight lines are going to technically pass through that terrain. A model standing on top of the terrain casting the shadow gets to ignore both the terrain and the shadow if at least one sight line passes through 1 inch or less of that terrain, looking from above as always. In this situation, we have a Frycorman on the ground and one on top of a height 3 building that is 4 inches across. When the Frycorman on the ground shoots his Clockwork Revolver projectile attack at Summerteeth Jones, Summer gains no cover because none of the sight lines between the two models cross over the building casting the shadow. When this same Frycorman shoots at Lenny, Lenny does gain cover because some of the sight lines do cross over the building. The Frycorman on the building is half an inch away from the edge near Summer, but more than 2 inches away from the edge near Lenny. When drawing line of sight to Summer, the Frycorman gets to ignore the terrain and the shadow because there is only half an inch of terrain between them. He'll calculate range normally given their height difference, and Summer does not gain cover. If the Frycorman tries to draw line of sight to Lenny on the other side of the building, there is more than 1 inch of the terrain between them, and Lenny is in the shadow of terrain the same height as his size, so all the Frycorman's sight lines are blocked and he has no shot. If the outcast targets this Bayou Gremlin, which is completely outside the shadow of the terrain, none of these rules matter. The Frycorman draws line of sight normally, ignoring the building because he's standing on it, and calculating the range with their height differential in mind. If Lenny and Summer try to return fire against the Frycorman, they will find all of their sight lines blocked because they are in the shadow of terrain taller than they are, so any of their sight lines that pass through that terrain are blocked. They would be able to draw line of sight to the Freikormen only if he were at or hanging over the edge of the terrain. The Bayou Gremlin may draw line of sight to the Freikormen since the Gremlin is outside the shadow. Just for kicks, let's say that size 4 Ma Tucket Mecha Meemaw walks into the shadow of this terrain. If she were here on the near side, the Freikormen would still ignore the first inch of the terrain and fire without penalty, ignoring both the terrain and the shadow. If she were on the far side by Lenny, the sight lines from the Freikormen pass through the terrain and are not blocked because Mecha Meemaw is taller than the terrain. She gains cover from being in the shadow, and because the sight lines pass through the terrain, so she gains +1 to her defense stat, and the Freikormen has a negative modifier to his damage flip if he succeeds in shooting her. If he had a non-projectile ranged attack, none of this would matter, and he could use it against her normally. In either position, Mecha Meemaw may shoot the Freikormen freely because she is taller than the terrain, and he does not gain cover because he is on top of the terrain and not in its shadow. If both models are standing on top of the same piece of terrain and want to draw line of sight to one another, shadow, cover, and the rest of these rules do not apply. Shadow extends out from the terrain, not above it. Since both models are on top of the terrain, it affects both of their size and elevation equally, so it's really the same as if they were both on the playing area below. Unless there's something else on top of the terrain like a pillar or crate that might interfere, they draw line of sight to one another normally. To recap, normally, if a model is taller than the terrain between it and another model, they both have line of sight to one another. If a model taller than the terrain is in that terrain's shadow, it can still be shot, but gains cover against projectile attacks if any sight lines cross the terrain. Cover gives it +1 to defense and imposes a negative modifier on the damage flip, if any. If a model the same size as the terrain or smaller is in the terrain shadow, all sight lines to and from that model are completely blocked if they cross that terrain. If a model is on top of the terrain casting a shadow, it may shoot normally at models outside of that shadow, since the attacking model is taller than the terrain because it's standing on it, and therefore may ignore it. The model on top of the terrain can shoot normally at a model inside the shadow if at least one of the sight lines passes through 1 inch or less of that terrain. Any sight lines from the attacking model to a model in the shadow that pass through more than 1 inch of the terrain are completely blocked, since the target is in the shadow, if the model is shorter or the same height as the terrain. If the target model is taller than the terrain and in its shadow, the target gains cover if the sight lines pass through more than 1 inch of that terrain. Sight lines from models in the shadow of the terrain to a model on top of the terrain are blocked if the attacking model is the same size or smaller than the terrain. If the model on top of the terrain is at the edge or hanging over it, then the sight line isn't crossing the terrain and there is line of sight. If two models are on top of a piece of terrain, they both ignore the terrain and neither gets cover. Shadow extends out from terrain, not over it. That's the overview of terrain with the height and blocking characteristics and the shadow of terrain. Pick up a printable set of all the markers and tokens you need to play Malifaux in the Wargame Vault. If you haven't already, join our Patreon for early, ad-free access to all new content, and be sure to visit the Malifaux University gift shop for the latest in Malifaux-themed shirts, hoodies, drinkware, and more. Links are in the notes below. And remember, play friendly games, keep it simple, and have fun.